They laughed when Arthur planted weeds among his crops. They mocked his crooked flooded ditches at the local diner. But when the blackest storm in a century swallowed Oakhaven Valley, the laughing stopped. By morning, thousands of acres were a wasteland. Only one farm remained standing. This is why. Oakhaven Valley was a place where success was measured in straight lines and green steel. For generations, the sprawling heartland community had prided itself on efficiency. Here, agriculture was an industrial assembly line unrolled across the horizon, 5,000 acres of genetically modified corn neatly partitioned, ruthlessly sprayed and harvested by GPS-guided combines that cost more than a suburban mansion. At the top of this hierarchy sat Thomas Griggs. A third-generation mega-farmer, Griggs controlled a staggering percentage of the valley. He was a man who viewed dirt not as a living ecosystem, but as a sponge designed solely to hold synthetic nitrogen and chemical fertilizers, long enough for the corn roots to drink it up. His fields were immaculate. Not a single weed dared to breach the chemically scorched earth between his razor-straight rows. Then came Arthur Pendleton. Arthur wasn't a farmer by birth. He was a former civil engineer from Chicago who had suffered a stress-induced heart attack at 45. Seeking peace and driven by a decades-long obsession with soil ecology, Arthur took his life savings and purchased the old Miller tract. It was a 40-acre square of exhausted dead dirt that sat at the bottom of a gentle slope bordering Griggs's massive empire. The land had been over-tilled and chemically abused for decades until the topsoil was mostly dust. The local real estate agent, a man named Jim Caldwell, had privately joked that Arthur was buying a very expensive sandbox. The drama began almost immediately. Instead of hiring a crew to deep rip the soil and dump anhydrous ammonia to prep for a standard corn rotation, Arthur rented a modest mini excavator. For 3 weeks, he drove the machine in agonizingly slow curving lines across the property. He dug deep, wide trenches that followed the natural contours of the landscape, piling the excavated dirt on the downhill side to form mounds. In the world of permaculture, these were called swales, water harvesting ditches designed to catch rainstop erosion and sink moisture deep into the water table. To the locals of Oakhaven, it looked like a lunatic had been let loose with heavy machinery. "I drove past the Miller place yesterday," Thomas Griggs announced loudly one morning at Betty's Diner, the local hub for agricultural gossip. He stirred his black coffee, a smirk playing on his lips. "The city boy is building a moat. I think he expects a medieval siege." The diner erupted in laughter. "I asked him what he was doing," added Richard Hayes, the local bank manager who had overseen Arthur's mortgage. "He told me he was hydrating the landscape. I told him he was destroying perfectly good tillable acreage. You can't run a tractor over those humps." Arthur's eccentricities didn't stop at the swales. While Griggs's fields lay bare and exposed to the harsh winter winds, a standard practice to prepare for spring planting, Arthur was out in the freezing rain, broadcasting what the locals considered weeds. He planted daikon radishes, winter rye, and hairy vetch. He dragged in hundreds of rotting logs from a nearby municipal clearing project and buried them under mounds of earth, creating hugel culture beds. He planted fruit trees in wild, curving polycultures instead of neat harvestable orchards. He threw seeds for deep-rooted prairie grasses right next to his vegetable cash crops. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. It was a messy, overgrown, disorganized catastrophe. They dubbed it the hobby garden. The financial strain on Arthur and his wife Claire was immense. Rebuilding dead soil is not a profitable enterprise in the short term. In their first 2 years, their yields of heirloom tomatoes, squash, and root vegetables were meager. The soil was still too compacted, lacking the biological life necessary to feed the plants naturally. They were burning through their retirement funds just to keep the lights on. Claire, a former school teacher who had taken a job at the local library to secure health insurance, often found Arthur sitting on their back porch at night, staring out at the chaotic shadows of his swales. Griggs broke the county yield record today. Claire mentioned softly one October evening, setting a mug of tea beside him. "Betty told me at the library, 280 bushels an acre," Arthur sighed, rubbing his calloused hands. "It's an illusion, Claire. He's pumping the soil with steroids. It's hydroponics in dirt. The ground over there is dead. It has no structure, no carbon. It's just dust held together by chemical salts." "I know," Claire said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "But the bank doesn't look at soil structure, Arthur," Richard Hayes called again. "We're 2 months behind on the equipment loan. He asked if you were finally ready to clear the brush and plant a cash crop." "This is the cash crop," Arthur insisted, his voice tight with frustration. "It just needs time. The mycelial networks are just starting to connect. The earthworms are returning. If we plow it now, we kill the immune system we just spent 2 years building." But time was a luxury they couldn't afford. The town's mockery had evolved from lighthearted teasing to open hostility. Arthur's wild farm was becoming a nuisance. Griggs complained to the county board that Arthur's weeds were threatening his pristine fields with seeds blowing in the wind. The county weed commissioner was dispatched to issue warnings. Arthur had to spend agonizing hours in bureaucratic meetings explaining the difference between invasive noxious weeds and beneficial cover crops. The pressure was suffocating. Arthur was a pariah, a madman playing in the dirt while the real farmers fed the world. He was isolated, financially drowning, and surrounded by an ocean of genetically uniform, chemically dependent corn. But deep underground, invisible to Thomas Griggs and the patrons of Betty's Diner, Arthur's soil was quietly coming back to life. By the 4th summer, a stark physical division had formed between the Pendleton property and the Griggs empire. It was a boundary line so sharp it looked as though it had been drawn with a ruler. On Griggs's side, the earth was a pale, chalky brown, years of heavy John Deere. 9 RX tractors rolling over the fields had compressed the ground into hardpan, a layer of soil so dense it was nearly impenetrable to water and roots. When it rained, the water didn't soak in. It sheeted off, carrying precious topsoil and expensive synthetic nitrogen straight into the county drainage ditches, fueling massive algae blooms in the local river. On Arthur's side, the soil had transformed. It was dark, crumbly, and smelled like a deep, ancient forest. The rotting logs buried in his Hugel Kultur mounds had become sponges soaking up the spring rains and holding the moisture. His deep-rooted radishes had broken through the natural hardpan, dying in the winter, and leaving behind deep channels for water and earthworms to travel. The messy canopy of his varied crops shaded the soil, preventing the summer sun from baking the moisture out of the earth. But the real test came in August when Oak Haven Valley was hit by a brutal, unyielding flash drought. For 6 weeks, the sky remained a cruel, cloudless blue. Temperatures hovered in the high 90s. The wind blew hot and dry, turning the valley into an oven. The crisis hit Griggs' operation almost immediately. Because his soil was completely devoid of organic matter, it had zero water-holding capacity. His shallow-rooted, chemically pampered corn began to curl and turn a sickly, grayish green. The dust devils that danced across his fields carried away tons of topsoil. Panic set in. Griggs, heavily leveraged with millions of dollars in bank loans for seed chemicals and machinery, couldn't afford a total crop failure. He deployed his massive center pivot irrigation systems, running them 24 hours a day. The diesel costs were astronomical. Worse, the aquifer beneath Oak Haven was dropping fast. Several shallower residential wells in the area began to suck mud. Meanwhile, Arthur's hobby garden remained a vibrant, shocking emerald green. He didn't own a heavy irrigation system. He didn't need one. The thousands of gallons of winter rain he had captured in his swales were slowly seeping into the root zones of his plants. The heavy mulch and ground cover prevented evaporation, while Griggs was burning tens of thousands of dollars a week just to keep his corn on life support. Arthur was quietly harvesting a bumper crop of squash peppers and beans, selling them at a premium to high-end restaurants in the city who had finally discovered the superior taste of biologically grown produce. The sheer visual of Arthur's lush, green 40 acres sitting like an oasis next to Griggs's struggling yellowing empire drove Griggs to the edge of rage. It wasn't just an agricultural discrepancy. It was an insult to his entire worldview. One sweltering afternoon, Griggs's gleaming silver pickup truck crunched down Arthur's gravel driveway. Arthur was out in the heat, using a scythe to chop down a cover crop of rye to create a natural mulch mat. He paused, leaning on the wooden handle as Griggs stepped out of the air-conditioned truck. Griggs didn't bother with pleasantries. He looked around with open disgust at the winding paths, the mixed vegetation, and the fruit trees interspersed with vegetables. "Your little science experiment is pulling pests into my fields, Pendleton." Griggs lied, his face flushed red beneath his expensive Stetson. "And your messy runoff is clogging the county drains." "My land doesn't run off, Thomas," Arthur replied, evenly wiping sweat from his brow. "That's the point of the swales. Every drop of rain that falls here stays here. You know that. I haven't seen a drop of water leave my property in 3 years." Griggs ignored the logic. He walked up to the fence line, kicking at a thick layer of Arthur's wood chip mulch. "I'm losing money every day this drought continues. The aquifer is dropping. Yet you're sitting over here on top of the deepest part of the water table playing in the mud." "It's not mud, it's soil," Arthur corrected him quietly. Griggs sneered. "Whatever you want to call your dirt, Pendleton, you're sitting on premium water access. I'll make this simple. I want to buy this 40 acres. I'll give you 20% over market value. I'll bring the bulldozers in tomorrow, flatten these ridiculous ditches, and put a pivot irrigator right in the center so I can water my southern corn tract. You and your wife can take the cash, go back to Chicago, and retire." Arthur looked at the man. He saw the desperation hiding behind the arrogance. He saw a man fighting a war against nature, a war he was currently losing. "The land isn't for sale, Thomas," Arthur said softly. "And even if it was, I wouldn't sell it to you to be poisoned and paved over." Griggs's face hardened. The facade of the wealthy, benevolent businessman vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory stare. "You're a fool, Arthur," Griggs spat, his voice dropping to a menacing octave. "You think you're saving the world with your little hobby garden, but you're drowning in debt. I play golf with Richard Hayes. I know the bank is breathing down your neck. When this drought breaks you and the bank forecloses, I won't pay 20% over market. I'll buy it at auction for pennies on the dollar. And the first thing I'll do is run a D9 Caterpillar right over your stupid little trees." Griggs turned on his heel, climbed into his truck, and sped away, leaving a plume of choking white dust in his wake. That evening, the atmosphere in the valley changed. The oppressive dry heat suddenly gave way to a suffocating humidity that felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket. The barometer on Arthur's porch began to plummet so fast it seemed broken. Inside the house, the local weather radio suddenly erupted with a shrill, piercing klaxon. Claire rushed into the kitchen, turning up the volume. The voice of the National Weather Service forecaster was remarkably uncalm. "This is a rare and particularly dangerous situation. A massive, anomalous low-pressure system has collided with the stationary heat dome over the Midwest. We are tracking a historic supercell structure, a derecho event, combining with unprecedented atmospheric moisture. Catastrophic wind gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour and torrential historic rainfall are expected. This is a life-threatening event. Seek shelter immediately." Arthur stepped out onto the back porch. The sky to the west wasn't just dark. It was a bruised, unnatural, terrifying shade of purple and sickly green. The silence was absolute. No birds sang. No insects chirped. The trees were dead still, as if holding their breath. It wasn't just a storm coming. It was an atmospheric bulldozer. And it was heading straight for Oak Haven Valley. It hit just after nightfall, though the sun had effectively been blotted out an hour prior. There was no gentle preamble, no warning drizzle. The derecho slammed into Oak Haven Valley like a solid wall of kinetic energy. Arthur and Claire were in their basement, surrounded by shelves of the canned tomatoes and pickled radishes that the town had mocked. Above them, the farmhouse groaned its ancient timber frame, protesting against the sudden violent pressure. The wind gauge on Arthur's weather station clocked a gust of 112 miles per hour before the anemometer was simply torn from the roof, shattering into the darkness. Out in the valley, the destruction was instantaneous. Thomas Griggs's 5,000 acres of genetically modified corn, dried and brittle from the 6-week flash drought, stood no chance. The stalks planted in shallow, dead soil lacked the deep root anchors necessary to withstand even a modest gale. When the derecho's leading edge struck, the corn snapped at the base, millions of plants sheared off in unison. It sounded like the rapid-fire discharge of 1,000 rifles. In a matter of minutes, a multi-million-dollar harvest was flattened into a tangled, useless mat of green debris. But the wind was merely the vanguard. Then came the water. Meteorologists would later call it a 1,000-year rain event. The supercell stalled over the valley, trapped by the stationary heat dome, and dumped a catastrophic volume of water. 11 inches of rain fell in fewer than 3 hours. On Griggs's sprawling mega farm, the conditions for a geological disaster were perfectly aligned. The heavy John Deere tractors had compressed the earth into concrete-like hardpan over decades. Because Griggs had rigorously sprayed herbicides to keep his rows free of weeds, there was no ground cover, no organic matter, and no living root systems to hold the dirt together. When millions of gallons of water crashed down upon this impenetrable surface, it couldn't soak in. It pooled for a fraction of a second before gravity took hold. The water began to move, gaining speed and mass. It transformed into a devastating sheet flood. The runoff stripped away the top 2 inches of topsoil, the only vaguely fertile dirt left on the property, heavily laden with expensive, recently applied synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus. This toxic, muddy slurry became a scouring pad. It carved deep, jagged gullies through the fields, some wide enough to swallow a pickup truck. It tore through Griggs's heavy center pivot irrigation systems, twisting the aluminum pipes like tinfoil and dragging the massive tires through the mud. Down in the valley basin, Arthur sat on a crate in the dark, holding Claire's hand. The power had failed within the first 10 minutes. The noise was deafening, a relentless roaring waterfall hammering against the siding of the house. His mind raced with terrifying calculations. He had designed his swales to handle an 80-year flood. He had dug them deep and wide, plotting them carefully along the contour lines of the slope to catch and pacify heavy rain, but 11 inches in 3 hours. This was beyond any model he had ever studied. If the upper swale breached the sheer volume of water, would cascade down to the next, causing a domino effect. Millions of gallons of water would violently overflow the trenches, tearing out his fruit trees, washing away his hugelkultur beds, and sending a tidal wave of mud directly into the farmhouse foundation. "Arthur!" Claire yelled over the din, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Water is seeping under the basement door." Arthur rushed to the wooden stairs. A thin, muddy film was indeed spreading across the concrete floor. His heart pounded against his ribs. It was happening. The system had failed. The land was drowning, and they were about to be washed away with it. He grabbed a crowbar and a battery-powered lantern, preparing to force the basement windows open for an emergency escape if the water level surged. For 4 agonizing hours, they sat in the damp darkness, waiting for the walls to collapse. The thunder shook the dust from the basement joists, and the relentless pounding of the rain felt like a physical weight pressing down on their chests. Around 3 in the morning, the roaring gradually softened to a steady drumming. By 5, it was a gentle drizzle. By 6, an eerie, absolute silence fell over the property. Arthur pushed the heavy cellar doors open, stepping out into the gray, misty dawn. He braced himself for total ruin. He looked toward the slope. He blinked, wiping the rain from his eyes, struggling to process what he was seeing. The swales had not breached. They were full to the absolute brim, acting as long, winding, reflecting pools across the landscape, but the earthen mounds holding the water back were intact. The deep-rooted prairie grasses and thick layers of hairy vetch he had planted on the berms had woven a subterranean net of roots locking the soil together with the strength of rebar. The rotting logs buried in his hugelkultur beds had acted like giant subterranean sponges, drinking in thousands of gallons of water and keeping the surface from liquefying. His wild, chaotic polyculture of fruit trees, hazelnut bushes, and climbing vines had acted as a complex windbreak, shattering the straight-line winds and protecting the delicate vegetables beneath their canopy. There was damage, of course. Branches were snapped. Some trellises had collapsed, and a section of his heirloom tomatoes was crushed. But the farm, the living, breathing ecosystem he had sacrificed his life savings to build, had survived. The soil was fully intact. Not a single drop of muddy runoff had left his property line. Arthur walked to the edge of his property, to the fence line that separated his land from Thomas Griggs's empire. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. The sun broke through the dissipating clouds, illuminating a landscape of unimaginable devastation. Griggs's 5,000 acres were gone. The land had been entirely stripped of its topsoil, leaving behind a barren, pale, rocky subsoil that looked like the surface of the moon. Deep, treacherous ravines scarred the earth completely impassable. Half buried in a river of toxic, chemical-laden mud was Griggs' brand-new combine harvester, tilted at a sickening 45-degree angle. The true catastrophe, however, lay further down the valley. The massive wall of water, carrying thousands of tons of Griggs topsoil and concentrated chemical fertilizers, had slammed into the town of Oakhaven. The county drainage ditches, which Griggs had so frequently boasted about, were instantly overwhelmed. The toxic mud flow overtopped the banks of the local river, flooding Main Street. Betty's diner was submerged up to its windows in brown, foul-smelling sludge. The local hardware store's windows were blown out. The bridge on Highway 9, the only paved artery connecting Oakhaven to the state highway system, had been entirely washed away. By noon, the reality of the situation set in. Oakhaven Valley was completely cut off from the outside world. FEMA and state emergency services were mobilizing, but with the roads destroyed and the local airstrip buried in debris, heavy equipment and relief supplies were days away. Worse still was the water crisis. The municipal water treatment plant sat near the river. The sudden influx of agricultural runoff, a lethal cocktail of raw anhydrous ammonia, concentrated pesticides, and raw sewage from flooded septic tanks, had overwhelmed the facility's filtration systems. The town's taps ran brown, then sputtered and died as the pumps were shut down to prevent systemic contamination. 3,000 people were trapped without power, without passable roads, and without clean drinking water. Arthur didn't wait for a town meeting. He hitched his small utility trailer to his ATV. He loaded it with heavy-duty plastic drums and drove out to his lowest swale. The water in the trench was crystal clear. As the deluge had flowed over his property, the dense vegetation, the carbon-rich soil, and the layers of organic mulch had acted as a massive natural biofilter, stripping away impurities. The water had slowly percolated through the living earth, emerging clean and safe. He filled the drums-loaded crates of untouched summer squash, crisp bell peppers, and heavy mud-free root vegetables, and began the slow, treacherous drive toward the edge of town. He set up a distribution point on the highest ridge overlooking the flooded Main Street. At first, people just stared. They were shell-shocked, covered in mud, wandering aimlessly. Then they saw the water. Within an hour, a line stretched down the road. Arthur and Claire handed out rations of clean water and fresh food. In the late afternoon, a figure limped up the road. It was Thomas Griggs. The man looked broken. His designer clothes were caked in drying mud, his face pale and drawn. Walking beside him, looking equally hollow, was Richard Hayes, the bank manager. Hayes looked at Arthur, his eyes darting to the crates of pristine produce. "Arthur," Hayes croaked his throat dry. "The bank, the vault flooded. But that's not the worst of it. The collateral." Arthur paused, holding a jug of water. "What about it, Richard? Griggs's land?" Hayes whispered, his voice trembling. The insurance covers crop yield loss from wind and rain, but it doesn't cover topsoil washout. It doesn't cover the land fundamentally ceasing to be arable. He has millions in loans, and the land is worthless now. It's just bedrock and ravines. The EPA is already surveying by drone. The fines for the chemical runoff into the municipal supply. Hayes swallowed hard. The bank is over-leveraged on his debt. We're ruined. Griggs didn't say a word. He just stared at the dirt beneath Arthur's boots, the rich, dark, fragrant soil that had clung to Arthur's tires. Griggs raised his eyes, looking past Arthur toward the hobby garden. From this vantage point, the contrast was an indictment. As far as the eye could see in every direction, the valley was a brown, scarred wasteland of ruin and bankruptcy. But sitting right in the middle, a defiant square of brilliant emerald green, was Arthur's farm. The trees stood tall. The earth remained. The water was trapped, tamed, and utilized. It was a fortress of life in a valley of death. Griggs stepped forward. All the arrogance, all the mockery, all the certainty of his generations of industrial dominance had been washed away in a single night, leaving only a tired, defeated man. He looked at the jug of water in Arthur's hands. "Arthur," Griggs said, his voice cracking barely more than a whisper. "Please, my wife, she's thirsty." Arthur looked at the man who had threatened to bulldoze his life's work just days prior. He saw the patrons of Betty's diner in the line behind him. The men and women who had laughed at his swales called him a lunatic and reported him to the county. They were all holding empty buckets, watching him in silence. Arthur didn't gloat. He didn't demand an apology. He simply reached into the trailer, pulled out a fresh, cold, heavy jug of filtered water drawn from the very ditches they had mocked, and pressed it into Thomas Griggs's trembling hands. "Take it, Thomas," Arthur said gently. "There's plenty. The soil holds enough for everyone." Arthur's story proves that working with nature, not against it, is the only way forward. If this incredible true story of resilience and regenerative farming inspired you, please smash that like button, share this video to spread the word that true wealth actually lies in the soil. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable real-life stories of survival and triumph. See you in the next one.